Okay, welcome to the video here explaining the content rubric for the Unit 3A assessments. Now keep in mind, the content rubric will be the same for all projects regardless of whether you're doing a paper, movie, or a presentation. So this portion will be the same for all students. First off, when you look at the content rubric, let's talk about a few things here, just so you get the general idea as to what we're looking at. The first thing that needs to be pointed out is that everything in this rubric, every piece of content is focused back on this one question right here. What does a country need to have in order to build a strong foundation for the future? That's what I want everything in your paper, in your presentation, or in your movie. It all should really be focusing back on that single idea. Now, let's look more specifically here now at the different criteria. So we're going to be looking in this category right here right now, and then we'll come back and explain the point values. First, let's look at leadership. In terms of building a strong foundation for the future, let's underline that, we need to look at leadership and what role leadership played. I want you guys to include in this section specifically 2 examples of great leaders in early American history and 2 supporting details for each of those examples. We'll come back to that in a few minutes here. We're going to then look at government framework. In other words, how did the government play a really strong, important role in this? We're going to look at the Constitution a little bit with that. That's right here. Next, we're going to focus on the citizens, and really this one's going to be looking at land gains and how do we gain land, and why do we gain land really in terms of Louisiana and Florida, and how is that really focused on the citizens? That's going to be in comparison with when we look at a lot of let's say monarchies and kingdoms and empires in history. Really, when you gain land, it's more because the government wants to gain more power. In this situation, we're looking at gaining land really to help the people specifically. And then lastly, you're going to be able to choose another criteria of your own that you would like to focus on. It could be risk-taking, luck, it could be the fact that America stayed isolated and that helped them to build a strong foundation. Nonetheless, with all of these, I want you to focus on the fact that it's all about building a strong foundation for the future. That's the key here. Let's move on here and let's start focusing on one in particular, and that will be leadership. Now, for these 3 levels, let's talk about the 0, the 4, and the 5 really quickly here. If you have a 0, that means you need to redo this. Now, if you have, and as you could notice, there is no 1, 2, or 3 here because it jumps all the way up to 4. So basically, if you do not earn a 4 on this, you're going to earn a 0 and you're going to be required to make it up. There's going to be no penalty for it. It's not that you have 1 chance and you get a 0 and you're done. It's that you have a 0 until you do a certain amount of work to show that you understand this idea fully, which is what we're going to call a proficient grade of 4. We'll talk about 5 in 1 second. So again, we're looking at the leadership with Washington and Jefferson. Now, what you need to do is you need to have multiple strong and accurate supporting details for America. Okay, so what you're going to do is talk about leadership in America. To get this, you need to have, I'm going to call it 2 by 2. And this is great handwriting there. You guys love that, I'm sure. We need to have 2 examples, and we need to have 2 supporting details for each example. So this means we're going to have, if it's a paper, you're going to have 4 sentences that are proving this specific point in this portion of the paper. Now, in order to get a 5, which is what we're going to deem mastery, what you need to do is you must not only include all the information with the 2 by 2 strong explanation for America, but you also need to make a comparison to another group's need for leadership, and you need to support that. For this, you need to have 1 example times 2 details for it, which means that at the end of the day, what you should have is 6 sentences proving leadership in order to get your mastery. Now, what type of comparison can be made? Well, let's look at that. We could do for America in the proficient score, you could talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson is who are people I would suggest. Washington for sure. Jefferson, if you want to use somebody else, you're welcome to do so. Maybe for a modern connection, you could talk about the role of Steve Jobs in building Apple and how important he really was to the design of that and to the building of that company. That could be a comparison to the modern times. Speaking about, again, let's focus on this one more time, building a strong foundation for the future. In other words, what was needed early on to make it so that this country could survive in the long term, just like in the case of Apple, what was needed in the early stages in terms of leadership being Steve Jobs to help it to last for a long time. Next, we have our government framework. Again, we have a 4 and a 5 here. So we're looking again at another 2 by 2 example. So that's what we're going to be having for all of these. So let's look at this more specifically. For proficient, you could speak about how the Constitution fits in and how it did things better than the Articles of Confederation did. We could look at this from a lot of different angles. You could speak about how the way that the government was designed with 3 branches of government really helped to make it so that it would succeed in comparison with other countries in which they don't have three branches and the government becomes very corrupt. If you want to be very straight to the lesson that we talked about, you could speak about how the Constitution was designed to be able to deal with internal affairs much better than the Articles of Confederation, and you can compare those being Shays' Rebellion with the Articles of Confederation versus the United States Constitution dealing with the Whiskey Rebellion. And similarly, you can speak about how the U.S. Constitution has been able to deal with a lot of foreign affairs as well, because they are able to handle conflicts with Spain in terms of gaining Florida, in terms of Britain with the War of 1812, things along those lines. So those are some examples for the proficient score. For the master, you could talk about the framework being important, maybe in a school how we have a really solid curriculum framework and speak to that a little bit. In a business, you could talk about regulations that businesses have to follow that ensure that they're going to do things appropriately as well. That's another direction that you can go with that. Third, a focus on the citizens. This one is the trickiest to understand, but it's actually pretty straightforward, so I'll explain what I mean by this. When we say focus on the citizens, what I'm really trying to get at with this is the idea that when America makes decisions, the design is to help the people of America, not to help the government of America. In specific, when you think about land gains, as I mentioned in the introduction to this video, when you look at Rome, for instance, when they tried to gain land in Rome, it was designed to make the empire more powerful. When we gain land in America, with the Louisiana Purchase and also with the annexation of Florida and as a part of the Adams-Onis Treaty, those really were both gained because we're trying to help specific people in America, because we're trying to focus on the needs of our citizens. When we look at a comparison you could talk about businesses and how they focus on the needs of their customers potentially, or potentially in some ways. Maybe the airlines, they felt they needed to make a change to make people feel more secure on airplanes and make air travel more secure, so they decided to put in much stricter searches on people. You can think of a lot of different ways that we can go with this, so it doesn't have to be one specific idea that aligns with what I said. And lastly, another criteria of your choice. This is the one that could be tricky, another one that could be tricky as well, because you need to think of something on your own. Now I'll give you a few examples that you are allowed to take as well. One that you could say, and again, by the way, when we focus on this, remember, it's always about building a strong, didn't mean to underline that, building a strong foundation for the future. So what is it that we had to do in America? Maybe you could say, and I was trying to kind of play up the idea of risk, maybe America had to and countries had to take good risks in order to succeed in the long term. For instance, having a president in America included in our U.S. Constitution, that was definitely a risk, because people in America were very, very concerned, what would this president turn into? Would it turn into a king? Maybe that's that. An example I gave for a school is for a good school district, maybe they have to be willing to take risks as well, trying out new technology to see if it's going to work out well prior to doing a large-scale implementation of it. So those are some examples for that one as well. Overall, that is our Unit 3A content rubric explaining all the different point scales and also the specific criteria for the rubric. So.
Dude, he's like Chuck Norris.
Isn't it hilarious?